All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Parrish. I'm giving this presentation as kind of a high-level overview of salmonids in the Yakima Basin, and also some of the issues that they face and kind of their status as of the time of this presentation. I was asked to give this for kind of training purposes, but again, it's a high-level talk, so there's going to be a lot of generalizations here, but I think it's a pretty good primer to get you to understand the different salmonids that we have in our region. First of all, salmonids are all in the family Salmonidae. All of them are characterized by having this adipose fin here. In the Yakima Basin, there's a slight chance that you might run into a little fish called the sand roller that also has this adipose fin, but I've only ever seen one ever. So anytime you see fish in the basin and it has one of these adipose fins, you're pretty safe to assume that it is a salmonid. So all of our trout, salmon, whitefish all have this fleshy little appendage here. Sometimes our hatchery programs will actually remove this fin to mark our fish as being hatchery fish. So sometimes you'll find a fish that doesn't have one of these, but for the most part, our salmonids have this adipose fin here. We are going to be focusing on 7 different species, the 7 different salmonids of the Yakima Basin. I'm going to begin up in the high in the watershed and then kind of work my way down. We're going to be looking at bull trout, cutthroat, steelhead / rainbow trout, the different runs of Chinook, coho, sockeye / kokanee, and then also quickly talk about the mountain whitefish, which is kind of the forgotten salmonid in the Yakima Basin. I'm going to go over some background information on why salmonids are in the Pacific Northwest, touch on those 7 native species that I've already kind of run through, look at the spawning and breeding location of each one of those runs or species, talk about migration and spawning timing, go over quickly some juvenile information, and then move on to a summary and wrap things up. First of all, I think it's really important to understand why the Pacific Northwest is dominated by salmonids. They have adapted to the disturbance and cold water that is really prevalent in our region. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with the area, it's our region's really been sculpted by glaciers and by volcanoes, and both these things can really do a number on salmonids for a short amount of time. So, the eruption of something like Mount St. Helens could wiped out the whole Toutle River for a while there, and people thought, salmonids weren't going to come back there. Also, ice sheets expanding, moving south, and then retracting up north could block and then reopen different streams. And so, salmonids were really well adapted for this, and they evolved to deal with these conditions. One thing is that they can inhabit really cold water, which we have had quite a bit of historically. Also, these disturbances, they're able to exit these systems and then recolonize them. Part of the salmon and steelhead life history is that they go out to the ocean. So if one cohort of fish is out in the ocean and a volcano happens, like in the Toutle River, for example, which is a tributary of the Columbia, it'll wipe out those fish, but then they'll be able to recolonize it as those ocean-going fish can move back into that system, or salmonids from another tributary nearby could come and recolonize that. Same thing with these ice sheets. As they expand and contract, they're constantly recreating and then closing streams for salmonids, and they were able to recolonize that over time. So these actions kind of selected for our salmonid species, and that's why they've been so successful in our region. Another really important concept that I think you need to understand working in the Yakima Basin, or any river really, but the Yakima Basin is a great example of this river continuum concept. And the whole idea is that your location along a river system dictates the species composition, the water quality, and also the aquatic plant community. And the Yakima Basin really shows this really well, because it happens naturally. basically starting up in the headwaters, you have these really closed canopy areas that don't receive a lot of sun. They typically have really low nutrients and they have a lot of stream power. As you shift down to the lower part of a river, if it's a large river like the Yakima, it looks completely different. It's a lower gradient, slower moving water, really open, a lot of sunlight coming in, and there's a lot of nutrients coming off the landscape. So this is something that naturally happens. Yes, we impact it through our development and things like that as humans, but the Yakima River, being the largest river in all, fully contained in the state of Washington, would have had a really strong example, is a really strong example of kind of the river continuum concept. So just kind of to break this down for you, in general terms, just looking at the Yakima Basin in our headwaters, really up high, we have cold, clear water. There's super closed canopy in here. Very little sunlight reaches the stream, so there's not very much solar inputs going into the system. So vegetation isn't really growing very much. There's not very much for nutrients there. The nutrients that do occur are usually terrestrial inputs coming from leaf litter or pine needles or other detritus, which drive the invertebrate community. Also, they're high gradient, so there's a lot of stream power in these areas. So the main substrate that can remain in these areas are large things like bedrock, boulders, and cobble, because smaller substrate get washed downstream in these powerful systems. Once again, those characteristics dictate the species. So there's a lot of mayflies, caddis, stoneflies, and then our really cold water adapted species like bull trout, cutthroat trout, rainbow trout, and sculpin are the primary fish species you'll find in our headwaters. As you shift down to, like, say, the middle reaches of our system, so I don't know, I'd say like somewhere from like Thorpe to Yakima area or something like that, we're starting to there's still really clear water, but the temperatures in that water is warmer than what you would see in the headwaters. Terrestrial inputs are still really important for the nutrients, but now there's more sunlight reaching the stream, so there is some primary production and aquatic vegetation growing, and then there's also some nutrients coming off the landscape. You'll see a shift from the largest substrates to having some smaller things like gravels become a little bit more dominant in the system because the lower gradient isn't washing those sediments out. The species, they start to get more diverse typically as you move down. You'll still have mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, but you start getting things like diptera or kind of the worms. There's crayfish, mussels, other things that can kind of make a living in this kind of region that kind of in the headwaters. A diversity in the fish species that start showing up. We have, omicus, so rainbow trout and steelhead, sculpin, chinook, the different runs start showing up in here, coho, whitefish, suckers, red side shiner, and dace. So there's an increase in diversity again as you move downstream. And then we'll keep on going on down to like the lower river, and this is where really this is a stark contrast from what the headwaters look like. So decreased water clarity, there's more turbidity with nutrients and stuff, and algal growth going on. There's higher stream temperatures, especially during the summer months when there's solar radiation pounding down on the stream. The riparian area has very little impact on the stream naturally because it can't shade it just because of how wide the river is here. There's an increase in nutrient levels coming off the landscape, whether humans were around or not. It's definitely it's increased a lot with human presence, but historically this would have been higher nutrient levels here too. There's a lot of primary production is driving the nutrients here because there's so much solar input. And it's a lot lower gradient, so there's really small substrate. You'll see a ton of sand and fines, especially along the beaches and in slower areas, or along the slack areas as well. So for that reason, all kinds of different species are showing up. We've now got more phytoplankton and aquatic vegetation in the river that are kind of making that living off of the sunlight. It's more dominated by kind of the mud species of the invertebrates. We've got worms, crayfish, mussels, zooplankton. In the Yakima Basin, in the lower portions of the Yakima River, there's no salmonids that live there year round. Fall Chinook make a living there seasonally when the water cools down, and then we have other adult salmonids and juveniles passing through there when water temperatures allow. There's pike minnows, sucker, chiselmouth, peamouth, and then a whole host of invasive warm water species that we'll get into a little bit later. So just to kind of compare and contrast the different life histories of the salmonids we have here, we have anadromous fish. Anadromous means that these fish go out to the ocean for part of their life and then return to freshwater to spawn. And then we have the migratory / resident population. So our bull trout, cutthroat, whitefish, and some other species, they spend their entire life in fresh water. Some of them might migrate, some of them might stay within the same couple of pools they've been in their entire existence. But they do not go out to the ocean. All right, I'm going to start once again. We're working from the cold water. Think about that river continuum concept that I was talking about. We're starting at the cold headwaters and working our way down. And so these fish are distributed in different areas because they've adapted to different niches that have been created in these regions. And so at the top of our watershed is the bull trout. They are listed as threatened in 1998. They're one of our 2 threatened species in the Yakima Basin. They exhibit both migratory and resident life histories. This can happen within the same spawning population. Sometimes there can be stayers and goers, or we have other populations that seem to be almost exclusively resident or exclusively migratory. The really important thing about bull trout is they're an indicator species that requires really cold, clean water. So they're really sensitive. They spawn during the fall. Juveniles that you can see in the top picture here, they typically spend 1 to 3 years in their natal spawning and rearing tributaries, and then they might migrate out if they're a migratory species, if they're a migratory population, to either a large lake, or out to a lake or reservoir, or out into a larger river where they can feed on other fish and get really big, and then return back to their native stream to lay their eggs. And they're Parrish. This word means that they're a repeat spawner. So unlike our salmon that we talk about, that are famous for making this huge journey, spawning and dying, and that's kind of the end of it, bull trout will spawn multiple times in their life history, or during their lifespan, if they can survive the different spawning trips, and they can live up to and over 12 years in some areas. The next one that occurs pretty much right alongside the bull trout is the West Slope cutthroat. They're a resident and migratory. Almost all of our headwater streams have small cutthroat populations in it, and they're really interesting and beautiful fish. They spawn during the early spring. They're also Parrish, so they can spawn multiple times during their life. They're really closely related to rainbow trout and steelhead, so frequently where their distribution overlap, you will see some hybridization in there. They can live up to around 12 years as well under good conditions. All right, so now we've got probably our most confusing fish, which is Oncorhynchus mykiss. They exhibit 2 life histories. They have resident, which are rainbow trout. They spend their entire life in life history. And then the anadromous life history is we refer to as a steelhead. So resident fish, once again, all in freshwater. Anadromous fish go out to the ocean for a couple of years or a year, and then return to freshwater spawn as a really large adult. These are the exact same species. We don't exactly know what triggers them to be a steelhead and go out to the ocean versus a resident fish, but 2 resident rainbow trout can produce an offspring that migrates out to the ocean and returns as an adult steelhead. So they're a little complicated, and similarly, steelhead offspring can become just resident rainbow trout. So they're confusing, but those life histories give them an incredible flexibility to deal with disturbance, and so that's one of the real benefits of them having these 2 different life histories. So we have Mid-Columbia steelhead in our basin. They were listed as a threatened species in 1999, so they're our second of our threatened species, and a lot of our grant work is tied to recovering them. Juveniles typically spend 1 to 3 years in fresh water, and then 1 to 2 years out at sea. They're Parrish. For rainbow trout, they spawn multiple times, just like the the cutthroat trout do. For steelhead, however, they have a bit more challenge because they have to survive a big gauntlet of migrating back out to the ocean if they want to spawn a second time. They will attempt to do this, but it isn't really common for them to be successful. However, it did happen a lot more historically, and it has been documented to happen in the Yakima Basin even recently. So historically, we would have had, returns of over 100,000 to the Yakima Basin, and but some of the more recent data and estimates of around 6,000 in 2011. So this species is really struggling, and as such is one of our priority species for recovery purposes. I mentioned the steelhead kelp. This is an example from when I used to work in the Methow up north, which is a tributary to the Columbia. But in this scenario, we would actually try and capture those steelhead that were out migrating, and then raise them up in a hatchery setting and return the females back and let them spawn again on their own. This was kind of a neat way to get wild fish to spawn multiple times. They do the same thing here in the Yakima Basin. However, they collect most of their kelps, their steelhead kelps at some of our dams, and they'll hang on to them and then take them to the kelp facility in Prosser, hold the females for a year, and then put them back in the river, and they'll run on up to their tributaries and spawn all over again. So anyway, I just wanted to point that little program out. When they're in those tanks, they'll feed them really high protein diets of krill and fish food and things like that, and get them bulked up before they put them back in the water. And then this is one of the larger fish that my coworker Leaf up north was releasing one of his steelhead kelts back to the Methow. And this was fish went from being almost completely emaciated when we captured it to being an absolute tank after a year of feeding on krill. Next, we're going to talk about the whitefish, the mountain whitefish specifically. There's 2 whitefish species in the Columbia Basin, but this is the most common one you're going to talk about. Often kind of the forgotten salmonid. They show resident and migratory life histories, but spend their whole life in fresh water. They spawn during the early spring, or during the winter and early spring, actually. They're idiroparous. They spawn multiple times, and they can live like a really long time. They're super abundant in the Yakima Basin. There's a pretty good fishery for them. You can catch and keep them in pretty much all of our streams during the winter months. All right, another one of these kind of confusing species, we've got Oncorhynchus nerca. They have 2 life histories. We've got the resident form, which we refer to as kokanee, and then the anadromous form, which we refer to as sockeye. So kokanee are just a landlocked sockeye. So in all of our reservoirs that we have in the Yakima Basin, kokanee either exist or were introduced. And so they just spend their whole life in the lake and in the tributaries there. The unique thing about Oncorhynchus nerca is that they require a lake for their life history. So basically, adult kokanee or sockeye spawn in tributaries or on the edges of reservoirs. They lay their eggs there, and then once the juveniles hatch out of the gravel, they'll immediately migrate to the lake if they aren't already there, and then they will rear in that freshwater lake environment for about over a year before then they try and migrate out to the ocean. If you're a kokanee, however, you don't migrate out to the ocean, you just stay there in the lake the whole time until you grow big enough to spawn. If you're a sockeye, you migrate on out, spend 1 to 2 years in the ocean, and then return to the Yakima Basin to spawn. Historically, there was upwards of 200,000 of them returning to the Yakima Basin each year. However, they were extirpated from the Yakima Basin in the 1930s upon the completion of the final storage reservoir in the Yakima Basin up on our headwater lakes where these fish naturally occurred. The Yakima Nation has done great work reintroducing these species to Lake Cle Elum, and they're installing some different infrastructure for the adults and juveniles to move in and out of Cle Elum, and hopefully this will be a real success story in the future. Coho, Oncorhynchus kisich. This species was extirpated from the Yakima Basin during the 1980s. This was primarily due to the operation of our irrigation and diversion infrastructure, kind of blocked them from getting back to most of the tributaries. However, they have been successfully reintroduced by the Yakima Nation. Some years they've had, large returns, but, most recently they've been struggling. They spend a little over a year in fresh water, then they go out to the ocean for 1 to 2 years, and they return as adults. Historically, we would have had over 150,000 of these fish come back to the Yakima Basin every year. However, in 2011, you say about 6,000 fish came back that year. So the Yakima Nation is working really hard to try and recover these fish, but there's a long way to go. Okay, now we're going to start talking about the different runs of Chinook salmon. I'm going to grab a quick drink here since my voice is getting dry. All right, so there's 3 different runs of Chinook salmon in the Yakima River. Includes spring Chinook, fall Chinook, and summer Chinook. Spring Chinook, these fish spend the most time as juveniles in the freshwater of any of those runs, and then they spend 1 to 4 years out at the sea before they return to the Yakima Basin and spawn. Historically, this would have been our biggest salmon producer in the Yakima Basin. Somewhere around 500,000 adults were estimated to return annually. In 2011, we had about 15, which was enough for them to initiate a small sport fishery. So the spring Chinook, there's a hatchery for them on the Clallam. They produce a lot of smolt there that they release, and this is a real species emphasis for the Yakima Nation for fishing purposes. Then we got the summer Chinook. The name, I didn't mention this yet, but the name before Chinook, so spring, summer, fall, basically describes the time of year in which they enter the Columbia River. So spring Chinook enter in the spring, summer in the summer, fall in the fall. And so that's where their name derives from those 3 different runs. Summer Chinook were extirpated in the 1980s, similar to coho, likely due to our infrastructure for irrigation that blocked some of them getting back to some of their places, and also really warm water temperatures in the lower river. They have very similar a life history to spring Chinook. However, they spawn a little lower in the watershed, and their juveniles can spend over a year in fresh water, but there's also some sub-yearling summer Chinook that'll migrate out as well and go out to the ocean. So I couldn't find some historic highs on these fish, I think, since they were extirpated, and there wasn't a strong data collected on these species on this run. All right, then we've got fall Chinook. So these are the largest salmon or steelhead that we have returning from the ocean to the Yakima Basin. They spend less than a year in freshwater. They spawn during the fall. Juveniles emerge during the winter, and then those juveniles will migrate out to the ocean that same spring after they hatch. So they spend the least amount of time in freshwater of any of our fish, and these fish have kind of adapted this life history because they can occupy habitat like the lower Yakima River, which gets way too warm during a lot of the year for these fish to even be there, but they can still spawn there, and their juveniles can get out before the water warms up, and then they can come back and spawn. So they've adapted to those conditions. These fish are really large. They produce thousands of eggs when they spawn, and those little teeny fish hatching out and immediately going downstream make a really easy snack for predators. But there's kind of safety in numbers. So with the thousands of fish that come out and immediately move downstream, they kind of prey swamp all those predators and find a way to make it out to the ocean. Adult returns, some are over 100,000, were estimated to return and spawn in the lower Yakima River. In 2011, about 2,700 returned and spawned in that area. Okay, now I'm going to give you a real general idea of where all those salmonids kind of hang out and spawn and rear. And once again, this is super general. There's exceptions to all these things. I'm just kind of trying to help you explain the different areas where you would encounter these different fish species. So sockeye and kokanee, they only exist where we have lakes. So we have really large storage reservoirs. Some of them were historically natural lakes on the headwaters of the Yakima Basin, and that's where you'll find our sockeye and kokanee populations. You'll also find bull trout and cutthroat hanging out in those areas. Bull trout used to be more migratory. They'd move to some of the lower reaches of the Yakima at different times of the year and then go back up there to spawn. But a lot of them are trapped above our reservoirs now and spend pretty much all their time up there now. In this area, we do have some bull trout in some of these streams here, but primarily you're going to see cutthroat, omicus, coho, and spring chinook. All these different runs have like carved out their own little niche of the type of habitat that they spawn in. However, they will co-occur as juveniles in different areas where they're rearing. Summer chinook primarily are spawning in kind of these lower reaches of the Yakima River. They'll probably expand their distribution upstream. The Yakima Nation is trying to reintroduce them, and they haven't really had huge numbers of fish that they've been able to release yet. So once those numbers start coming up, I would imagine they probably move a little further up the Natchez and up the Yakima into the Yakima Canyon a little further. Fall chinook. Historically just spawned pretty much below the town of Prosser. However, due to aquatic vegetation species, water stargrass, which has kind of taken over down there and blocked a lot of the historic spawning habitat, they've now shifted their spawning upstream to just below Union Gap now. You'll, I'm sure, learn a lot about water stargrass from other folks at a different point in time. But in general, this is where our fall chinook are hanging out. And again, they're only temporary occupants of the lower river because it gets too warm. Also, I just want to point out that our warm water invasive species that have been introduced, so our catfish, bass, pumpkin seed, all those things, they all hang out in these lower reaches of the river too when the water is warm enough to support them. All right, so this graph here, it's not perfect, but it gives you kind of some general idea on the migration and spawn timing of some of these fish. Bull trout, depending on the population, they will migrate some. However, I just put their spawning period on here just kind of represent. They primarily are spawning from September and into October. There's a couple populations that spawn on each end of that. Rainbow and cutthroat trout, generally around March, April, but also into May in different areas. Same thing with summer steelhead. They overlap with those species since they're so closely related, but you can see that summer steelhead are migrating into the Columbia River in the summer and then spending quite a bit of time in the Columbia River. They still feed when they're in that system and then eventually spawn in the late winter, early spring. Spring chinook enter the Columbia, as I mentioned, in the spring, and then try and get up the Yakima River as fast as they can. Once they get past about Prosser, they'll start looking for some place to hang out for a while, and then they'll kind of eventually make a final push up to their spawning habitat and spawn in August, September. Summer chinook, they enter the Columbia River during June, July, and August. But then they just have to hold below the Yakima, the mouth of the Yakima, until it cools down enough for them to move up. Sometimes rainstorms will allow them to kind of shoot up through there and find some cold water to hold upstream. But unless the Yakima, lower Yakima cools down enough, they're just waiting below the mouth of the Yakima to move up. That's pretty much the exact same scenario that's going on with our sockeye here as well. So they'll hold below the Yakima River mouth and then shoot up during rainstorms or cold snaps and eventually get up to a lake and then spawn. And then coho, they migrate into the Columbia River kind of the latest, and they also spawn the latest. So water temperatures in the lower river usually aren't as big of an issue for their migration period. This graph here is missing a few of the more recent years. So basically, it's kind of showing you that in the 1980s, we were in a pretty dire situation and almost lost all of our fish species. But through improved habitat and reconnection of historic spawning and rearing areas, our fish populations were able to recover. They've been in a downward trend recently. They're actually have been doing worse than what's shown here in this graph, because there's a few years that aren't on here. But it does go through, it's cyclical. You can see the natural rises and falls here. So hopefully we're just in a downturn, and then our conditions are going to improve, and we're going to start getting some big runs of fish here shortly is the hope. So, but anyway, we're doing a ton better than we were way back in 1983. All right, now this is once again general. So I have general salmon and steelhead temperature requirements. There's individual salmon and steelhead populations that have different temperature tolerances, and I took this from literature that is basically just looking at super general, making general statements. So don't try and fight me on this or really use this as like the hardest numbers. There's different local populations that have different numbers for their temperature requirements. But basically, like I said in the beginning, our salmon and steelhead and trout are all adapted to cold water. They can inhabit water from 0 to 26 degrees Celsius. However, anything that gets above really like 23 degrees is going to start making all of those species really uncomfortable. Bull trout especially, you won't see them occupying water that is over 18 degrees Celsius during the summer. So they have really stringent temperature requirements. Ideal temperatures in general for our salmonid species around 12 to 19 degrees Celsius. They feel really comfortable here. They can feed and grow really well. And then once you start getting into like the mid 20s, salmonids will start entering survival mode. So they'll start prioritizing finding cold water over searching for food. And so this can cause all kinds of negative effects. If it gets warm enough, they'll completely quit feeding and just start looking for cold water refuge. And this can increase their susceptibility to disease and also predation as they're more vulnerable looking for cold water. So to kind of explain to you why why salmonids aren't hanging out in the lower Yakima River during all times of the year, this graph here is basically got temperature on the y-axis, and then date on the x-axis here, and then the blue line is a thermograph, and then that pink line represents kind of suboptimal temperatures for salmonids. So you can see that in the lower river below at Prosser Dam, everything below that is going to be hotter than 70 degrees, basically from July or from June through most of September. And so that has all kinds of negative impacts. So you can see spring Chinook migration is occurring before that suboptimal lethal temperatures show up. And then if they haven't made it up the river in time, they'll probably die somewhere below the Yakima River and never make it up because that water will stay that warm for too long. They won't be able to hold off that long. And then on the other end of the spectrum, our summer Chinook and sockeye are trying to migrate as early as August. But if the water's as warm as it was during this year in 2018, they'll just have to hold at the mouth of the Yakima until it cools down. They can move upstream. So this is just an example of how temperature can really impact salmonids. Okay, now we're going to just quickly touch on juvenile salmonids. These species, sorry about that. Listed here, I've got some images of some different juveniles. You can kind of see some of the differences in their colorations and patterning. Not expecting you to get a lot from this diagram here, but basically just there's slight morphologic or not morphologic, but yeah, I guess there's some morphologic ones with a few of the species, but mainly just like phenotypic differences between them. If you were out in the streams, getting your hands on these fish all the time, you pretty quickly can start to tell these different species apart. But this table here is basically summarizing where these fish rear. And then also how much time they spend in fresh water. Again, this is general. Some of these species spend less than a year in fresh water in some areas. But in general, you can kind of run with this table that we have here. We're approaching the end of this presentation, but I just wanted to give a plug. If you want more information on some of these fish, I just touched on juvenile salmonids. But if you want to hear about what those juvenile salmonids go through during their smoltification and smolt outmigration in the Yakima Basin, I would encourage you to listen to another presentation I did for our winter speaker series in 2020 that basically looks at smolt outmigration and the challenges they face and some of the ways that we're trying to address the issues there. But that's going in way more detail than I wanted to for this talk. So if you want to learn more about that that life stage or that journey that those fish go on, I would encourage you to go to our YouTube page and search for smolt outmigration in the Yakima Basin, a challenge for fish and a challenge for us. All right, that's all I got for you. There's a lot of great information out there on more of these populations. You can look up the steelhead recovery plan. You can look up the bull trout action plan. The Yakima Nation has put together different documents on pretty much all the different runs of Chinook and coho and sockeye. You can Google to your heart's content, and there's a lot of information out there if you want to learn more about these individual species or populations in the basin. So this is meant to just be kind of a rough crash course introduction. but hopefully this will give you enough kind of information that you can then run on your own and expand your own knowledge. So, all right, good luck.